The world ended in a way no one expected. Not with war, not with fire from the skies, but with a sickness that spread like whispers in the dark. It began as an oddity: a few unexplained attacks, a couple of missing persons, news reports that barely made it past local broadcasts. But then the numbers grew, the screams echoed louder, and within days, the infection consumed entire cities. It wasn't long before the world as we knew it collapsed. The dead didn't stay dead. They rose with a hunger that could never be satisfied, a single-minded drive to consume and spread their plague. The governments fell, the armies crumbled, and civilization ceased to exist. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones became part of the endless, ravenous horde. But not everyone was lost. In the ruins of our world, survivors remained, some clinging to the past, others embracing the new nightmare. The infected weren't the only danger. Desperation turned people into monsters worse than the undead. Factions rose, territories were claimed, and those still breathing had to choose: fight, flee, or become the next meal. Hope is a dangerous thing in a world like this, but there is one last chance. A whispered rumor of a place where salvation might exist, where the virus could be stopped. No one knows if it's real, but for a handful of survivors, it's the only thing worth fighting for. The road ahead is drenched in blood, but they have no choice. Because in this world, the only thing worse than dying is surviving. It started with a few scattered reports, strange incidents that no one paid much attention to at first. A man in a rural town attacked his family, biting and clawing at them with inhuman aggression. A hospital in the city admitted a patient with a high fever, only for the patient to suddenly collapse, die, and then rise again minutes later. Doctors were baffled, and authorities assured the public that everything was under control. But it wasn't. The infection spread faster than anyone could comprehend. Within days, emergency rooms were flooded with violent, unresponsive patients. The symptoms were always the same: fever, delirium, then death followed by something far worse. Scientists scrambled to understand what was happening, but their efforts were met with confusion and failure. At first, they assumed it was an advanced strain of rabies, perhaps an engineered virus released by accident. Governments issued containment protocols, locking down entire neighborhoods, enforcing martial law, and silencing any reports that could incite mass panic. But soon, it was impossible to keep the truth hidden. The infection wasn't just an epidemic, it was an extinction-level event in the making. Cities fell like dominoes. The infected moved in relentless waves, biting and tearing through anyone in their path. Some survivors claimed the virus wasn't purely biological, that something else was at play, something unnatural. Those bitten lost their humanity almost instantly, their eyes clouding over, their bodies driven by nothing but hunger. The media collapsed, broadcasts went silent, and the last remaining governments struggled to maintain any sense of order. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. The world wasn't just changing, it was ending. And those who survived the first days of chaos would soon face a horror beyond anything humanity had ever known. In the beginning, people clung to the illusion that governments and scientists would find a cure, that help would arrive, and that life would return to normal. But as the days stretched into weeks, that hope crumbled. The reality was far worse than anyone had imagined. The infection wasn't just spreading through bites, it was airborne, seeping into every corner of the world, infiltrating homes, hospitals, and military bases. Even those who had never come into contact with the infected began showing symptoms, their bodies betraying them as they succumbed to the inevitable. Scientists worked frantically to understand the pathogen, but every attempt to halt its progression ended in failure. Some argued that the virus had mutated beyond control, while others whispered that it was never a virus at all, but something far older, something that had been waiting beneath the surface of the world, finally set free. Governments collapsed under the weight of their own desperation. Military forces tried to quarantine entire cities, firebombing infected zones, sacrificing millions in a last-ditch effort to contain the spread. But the infected didn't die so easily. The virus granted them unnatural resilience, their bodies defying decay, their hunger never ending. Soldiers who should have been victorious found themselves overwhelmed, their weapons useless against the sheer numbers of the dead. The rules of war no longer applied when the enemy felt no pain, had no fear, and never stopped. Soon, civilization crumbled into isolated pockets of survivors, each struggling to outlast the inevitable. Without leadership, without science, without order, the world became a wasteland of death and ruin. The fight for survival had begun, and those who remained were forced to accept the truth: no one was coming to save them. As the infection spread unchecked, the survivors quickly learned that the undead were not their only threat. The collapse of society had shattered the fragile order that once held humanity together. In the absence of law, morality became a luxury few could afford. People turned on each other in desperation, fighting over the last remnants of food, water, and shelter. Gangs emerged from the ruins of cities, groups of ruthless individuals who thrived in chaos, preying on the weak and hoarding supplies. What had started as a fight against the undead had now become a battle against other survivors, each faction carving out their own territory in a world where survival was the only rule. But the most horrifying part was how quickly humanity adapted. Once kind neighbors became killers overnight. Parents abandoned their children to save themselves. Trust became more dangerous than any zombie bite. Some survivors banded together in small, tightly knit groups, relying only on those they knew they could trust. Others became nomads, never staying in one place for too long, avoiding both the undead and the living. The world had become a brutal landscape where mercy was weakness and hesitation was death. Despite the brutality, hope still flickered in hidden corners of the world. Some sought refuge in underground bunkers or fortified compounds, clinging to the belief that there was still a chance for rebuilding civilization. Others searched for rumored safe zones, places untouched by the infection, where the last remnants of organized society still stood. But the longer the apocalypse raged on, the more it became clear this was not a temporary disaster. This was the new world order. And those who could not adapt would not survive. The remnants of the government and military had fought desperately to contain the outbreak in its early days, deploying troops, setting up quarantine zones, and enforcing martial law. But the infection moved faster than their preparations, spreading like wildfire through cities and strongholds alike. Entire battalions were wiped out overnight, their ranks turning against the living as the virus transformed them into mindless killing machines. Communications collapsed, leadership vanished, and what was once a global network of order and control crumbled into scattered groups of isolated survivors. What remained of the military either disbanded or became independent warlords, using their weapons and training to carve out their own domains in the ruins of civilization. Yet, in hidden bunkers and secret research facilities, a handful of scientists and military personnel still worked tirelessly, searching for a way to reverse what had already consumed the world. Some believed there was still hope for a cure, while others sought only to understand what had been unleashed. The truth behind the virus, whether it was a failed experiment, an unnatural mutation, or something deliberately engineered, remained shrouded in secrecy, lost amid the chaos. Some survivors whispered rumors of shadow organizations still pulling strings behind the scenes, manipulating events for their own unknown agenda. Others feared that even if a cure were found, there would be no one left to rebuild the world it had destroyed. As the days turned into months, then years, the idea of a structured society became nothing more than a memory. Governments were not coming back, and the world as it had been was gone forever. What remained was a lawless land where the strongest ruled, where survival depended on wit and brutality, and where the undead were no longer the only monsters haunting the ruins of humanity. As the years passed, the world adapted to its new reality. Survivors who had once clung to the idea of rebuilding civilization now lived by a different code, one of pure survival. The old rules of humanity had long since eroded, replaced by a ruthless struggle where trust was a rarity, and alliances were temporary at best. The undead were no longer the only threat, the living had become just as dangerous. Bandits roamed the wastelands, preying on the weak, while brutal warlords ruled over makeshift settlements with iron fists. Some survivors sought to carve out small, hidden communities, hoping to hold on to whatever scraps of normalcy they could. Others became nomads, wandering through the ruins, scavenging and fighting for whatever they could find. Despite the overwhelming odds, whispers of something more still spread among the scattered survivors. Stories spoke of a hidden sanctuary, a place untouched by the horrors of the world, a refuge where civilization had not only survived but thrived. Some believed it was nothing more than a desperate myth, a fantasy created by those who could not accept reality. Others claimed to have seen it, or at least met people who had come from it. Whether it was real or not, the mere idea of such a place gave many something to hope for in a world where hope was an endangered concept. Yet, even in this bleak world, evolution had begun to take its course. The virus was changing, adapting, mutating into something new. The undead were no longer just mindless husks, some exhibited intelligence, coordination, and an unsettling ability to learn. The war for survival was far from over, and as the living continued to struggle against extinction, one question remained: was humanity's time truly over, or was this merely the beginning of something even worse?